Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we'll be discussing the French Revolution. So the big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are: first, what were the major causes of the French Revolution? Second, what were the major phases of the French Revolution? And third, what were the similarities and differences between the French and American revolutions? So first, what were the major causes of the French Revolution? We can really discuss three major causes of the French Revolution. First, there was a significant debt that the French had accrued as a result of their involvement in a number of wars. First, we have the 7 Years' War, or what's known in the United States as the French and Indian War, which was fought between primarily the French and the British. It was really the first major global war. But we also had France's involvement in the American Revolution. So as you see in this image depicting the surrender at Yorktown, we have the British here that were surrendering to General George Washington and the colonial army here. But on this side, we have the French. So again, the French were very much involved in the American Revolution, and to fight wars, it cost a significant amount of money. And so France was building a larger and larger debt, and as a result, they had to impose more and more taxes. And in France, that tax burden fell almost exclusively on what's known as the Third Estate. So France was divided up into three estates. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was the peasantry. And so 97% of the population of France was represented in this third estate, but they had to pay 100% of the taxes because the first estate was exempt for taxes and the second estate was too. And so there was what was perceived as an unjust system of taxation in France. Second, there were Enlightenment ideas that were increasingly coming to the forefront, which were challenging the authority of the king and the church. So ideas like liberty and equality and popular sovereignty, that power comes not from God, but instead from the people. Ideas from thinkers like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Baron de Montesquieu. And we see these ideas kind of played out in a document that the French are going to draft called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And provisions within the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen are again going to stress ideas like men are born free and equal in rights, that there shouldn't be any social distinctions, and that France should be governed by a rule of law, not just the sort of arbitrary whims of the king. So again, these Enlightenment ideas are increasingly making their way into French thinking. And then finally, there is widespread famine. There is a bread shortage. Bread prices increase as population is growing in France, and they're outpacing their resources. And so there are these widespread famines, which leads to riots. So what were the major phases of the French Revolution? Really, the French Revolution begins with a meeting of the Estates General. So the king at the time, Louis XVI, is going to call together representatives of the three estates. So the clergy, the nobility, and the other people not represented in the first two estates. So at the meeting of the Estates General, the third estate gets very fed up, first of all, with having to pay all of the taxes, and also with the fact that they didn't have a lot of political clout in this meeting of the Estates General. So the first two estates could essentially outvote the third estate because each estate had kind of equal representation in this particular representative body. So what the members of the third estate did was they got together on a tennis court, maybe it was a handball court, and they declared an oath that they would continue to meet until they drew up a new constitution for France. And that's exactly what they did. After drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, they formed a new legislative body called the National Assembly, where they weren't seeking to get rid of the monarchy, but instead to create constitutional limitations on King Louis's power. So they wanted him to recognize these ideals of equality, of liberty, while at the same time protecting property rights of individuals. So Louis XVI is going to eventually perceive his powers as having been kind of taken away from him. He is going to attempt to escape to Austria, which was the location where his wife Marie Antoinette's family was from. And He's going to be stopped right before he gets to the border and brought back. He's going to be tried for treason, and he's going to be given the death penalty. He's going to be, his head is going to be stuck in the guillotine blocks and going to be chopped off as part of this more radical phase of the French Revolution known as the Reign of Terror. And it's in this Reign of Terror that all different facets of French society began accusing each other of being traitors. And this leads to widespread kind of death by way of the guillotine. And it begins this radical phase of a revolution. So usually you have this major movement away from the status quo, what's known as the sort of radical phase of a revolution. And oftentimes you have attempts to then come back and sort of moderate. We see it with the American Revolution, where there's this fear of centralized power, where they attempt to create a more decentralized league of colonies under the Articles of Confederation. That's the radical phase of the American Revolution. And then we see this gradual walking back of those radical ideas under the Constitution. Well, during the radical phase of the French Revolution, there were a number of leaders, including Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins, who were these radicals, who wanted a complete restructuring of French society. So they were especially targeting the Catholic Church, and they were advocating for these more kind of enlightened ideas, focusing on science and reason. And so they developed a number of things. For instance, they developed a new calendar system. They didn't like the idea that we had a 7-day calendar system, which was based on, the book of Genesis. And the French then decided, well, we need to instead have like 10 days in our week. Far more rational system. And we need to abolish this 28 days in some months and 30 days in other months, 31 days. So they created a system with 30 days made up essentially of 3 10-day weeks. And they believed again and made the argument, the case, that this was a far more rational approach to structuring their society. They also confiscated church property. They sold off some of it, and then they converted some of the existing Catholic churches to what are known as temples of reason or philosophy. So again, this is a kind of classic secular approach to forming and structuring a society. At the end of the day, though, again, this is known as the Reign of Terror because there was a significant amount of chaos within French society. And so it's the military who rises over time to power. It is a democratic republic. People have representatives that they can elect, but ultimately it's the people with guns who end up seizing the most power in French society, partly because the economic problems hadn't been solved. Right? Economic problems were still affecting and plaguing France, and as we're going to see in world history, when we have societies that are mired in economic problems, oftentimes they will turn to a single leader in order to try and solve those problems. And in the case of France, that leader was Napoleon Bonaparte, a military general who seizes power in 1799. Now, Napoleon wasn't particularly tall, only standing about 5'6", although that's sometimes a kind of myth about Napoleon. He actually was pretty average height for most Frenchmen. Napoleon was a moderate reformer. Again, he's going to seek to sort of moderate and move away from these more radical ideas that were part of the sort of movement by the Jacobins. And so he's going to promote principles of equality and property rights. So he's going to want to abolish sort of titles of nobility. In that sense, he sort of embraces the ideas of the revolutionaries. However, he's not going to sort of radically seek to seize property on behalf of the state and redistribute it. We're really going to see those kind of ideas, those more radical ideas, played out in the socialist communist revolutions in period 6. So the Russian Revolution and the Chinese revolutions, we'll see those more radical restructuring of property rights taking place in the period 6 revolutions. Period 5 revolutions, not nearly as radical. Napoleon also supports bringing back the Catholic Church, right? This idea that we can live in a more secular society didn't work for Napoleon. Now, Napoleon was a military leader. As we'll see, military leaders oftentimes are pretty into suppressing opposition, right? They're sort of used to following a chain of command. And so Napoleon is one of these people who limit freedom of speech in France, but he ultimately was relatively successful as a military commander. He's going to expand French boundaries all the way over into Spain and into Portugal. So there's the French invasion of the Spanish and the Portuguese, which is going to be a critical event when it comes to the people of the Americas, right? Because the Spanish and the Portuguese have established colonies in the Americas, and with these Napoleonic wars essentially distracting Spain and Portugal from their colonies, the colonies will then engage in a number of revolutions to free themselves from the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, Napoleon is going to eventually make the fatal mistake, though, of trying to invade Russia. And you can see it in this infographic. It shows you in the size here of the line represents the size of Napoleon's army. So he starts out with around 600,000 soldiers as they're making their way towards Moscow over here. You can see his army shrinking as the temperature is declining. And eventually he's forced to turn back, and he ends up back in France with only about 15,000 of the 600,000 that he left with. So he's defeated. He's eventually exiled into an island called Elba off the coast of Italy. He then is able to escape and sort of reassert power, and then is defeated again at the Battle of Waterloo. And so that's really the story of Napoleon. Eventually loses power in about 1815. So what are the similarities and differences between the French and American revolutions? In order to answer this question, I want you to fill out the Venn diagram that's on the bottom of your note sheet. And specifically, let's answer these questions. 1, whose ideas influence these revolutions? 2, what issues spark these revolutions? What were some of the similar causes? 3, what were the effects of these revolutions on the form of government? What kind of government do they start with? And what form of government do they end with? 4, were property rights protected in these revolutions? Yes or no? 5, how did these revolutions limit the power of government? Specifically, what did they draft or create in order to limit the powers of government? 6, just think a little bit about the timing. Which revolution comes first? Which revolution sort of builds upon the ideas of the other? 7, what were the revolutionaries fighting for? Who were they fighting against? That really is an important distinction. And then 8, how revolutionary were these revolutions? Can you make a case that one revolution led to more significant change than the other? So after you've completed the Venn diagram, you should be able to answer that third big question. So again, what were the major causes of the French Revolution? And then what were the major phases of the French Revolution? And then what were similarities and differences between the French and American Revolution?